Good morning. Thanks very much for coming, and thank you to Matt for those very nice remarks, and thank you as well to the conference organizers for inviting me to come and speak. I am in the middle of a pretty intensive speaking tour that has been scheduled for quite a long time, and when I got the invitation to come and speak here, had I been thinking at all rationally, I would have instantly said, I'm sorry, I can't make it, because I essentially had to squeeze in about a 9-hour visit to Washington in between very long flights elsewhere that I did last night and I'm about to do when I leave here. But I wasn't thinking rationally. I was instead thinking about the fact that almost immediately before receiving the invitation to speak here, I had watched online the speech that Aaron Swartz gave at this conference last year, and was incredibly inspired and moved by it. It was actually the second time I had seen it. I had seen it around the time that it was delivered. And I had written about Aaron, and I just felt as though coming and speaking at the same conference that he spoke at, where he gave such a profound and moving speech full of all kinds of insight and inspiration, was almost an obligation to really commemorate and pay honor to not just Aaron and his work, but to really the spirit that's animating it, that animated it. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think that spirit is, because I think it's actually become somewhat contagious. But it's not just the spirit that animates it that becomes contagious, but also the response of the state and those who wield power to that spirit that is proliferating probably even a little bit more quickly. I first wrote about Aaron and his criminal case back in 2011, and I did that in the context of having spoken to a reporter from the New York Times, Noam Cohen, who was he wanted to write a story about how young activists who were engaging in meaningful dissent were having the weight of the state come crashing down upon them as sort of a way to make an example out of them and deter future activism. That's what I discussed with the New York Times reporter, and in the course of talking about that with him, I compared the case of Aaron and the obvious prosecutorial excessiveness that the state was exhibiting in Aaron's case to the prosecutorial zeal that was being exhibited as applied to Bradley Manning. And I talked about the comparison between those two individuals, Bradley Manning and Aaron Swartz, and the way in which the state had responded to each of them. And I know that in response to this New York Times article where I was quoted making that comparison, there were some people who were friendly with or supportive of Aaron who were somewhat uncomfortable with that comparison. In part for pragmatic reasons, that they felt that the more he was tied to Manning, the more difficult it would be to get leniency, in part on grounds of principle, that they felt like what Aaron had done wasn't actually similar to what Manning had done. And there are substantial differences between the two, and there are substantial differences between those cases, but without diminishing those, I think there are also some really important similarities, not just between those two cases, but with lots of other cases that we're now seeing that are strikingly similar and revealing in important ways. And so I just want to talk about a couple of those similarities that I think are so meaningful. There's some obvious ones. They're both examples of people who are very young, who, as Matt just indicated, could have used their capabilities and talents for pure personal gain, for pure careerist advancement, and who made the conscious choice to sacrifice those personal interests in pursuit of a collective good, a conception of collective good. And that, to me, that act of knowingly sacrificing one's own personal interests, one's careerist advancement, one's material comfort for this conception of collective good, is really the embodiment of what political heroism is about. I've been really fortunate in the course of doing what I do to become friendly with someone who, before I knew him, was really the person who I would probably have named as my personal political hero. And that's Daniel Ellsberg. And the reason I've always considered him a personal hero is because he made exactly that same choice in the 1960s, when he was entrenched in the national security state. He was someone who wielded a law degree from Harvard. He had a background as a Marine. He worked for the Rand Corporation, was very high up in the U.S. government, and could have continued on that path to unknown heights, and yet could not in good conscience continue to participate in a system that he knew was propagating evil, and purposely undertook acts that he knew was likely to send him to prison for life
in order to help end that evil. And he would have gone to prison for life had it not been for the extreme fortune of having a federal judge who thought that the conduct of the Nixon administration was so severe that it warranted dismissal of his case. He would still be sitting in a federal prison today if not for that stroke of good luck. And the reason that I've always viewed him as the pure hero is because that choice to me is pure heroism. And it's one that we're seeing people of this age make increasingly in the face of the kinds of injustices that propelled Aaron to do what he did. Of deterring and intimidating actual dissent. I spoke yesterday at Brooklyn College, and I talked about the erosion of civil liberties in the United States and the importance of demanding that the promise of the Constitution be faithfully applied to state power and that governments and states not be permitted to transgress these lines that we've imposed on them as a condition for recognizing their power as legitimate and valid. And a few students afterwards stood up in the question and answer session and made a similar point, which was, well, look, you talk a lot about the need to restrain state power and to guard against state abuses, but what about private sector abuse? The role of corporations are playing is growing increasingly in our lives. Isn't it important to constrain and restrict corporate power as well? And the Constitution doesn't say much about that, and so isn't it really an incomplete document? And it is an incomplete document, but the reason why it's so vital in the first instance to think about how to constrain abuses of state power is because the power of the state is singular. It is unparalleled in its potency. It is the state that can charge us with crimes. It's the state that can take away our property. It's the state that can put us into cages for years or decades or life. It's the state that can kill us. And it's the state that does, in fact, exercise all of these powers. And so if you allow the state to exercise all of those powers without any constraints, the consequences are genuinely limitless, because those are the most awesome powers that can be exerted. And I think the key implication that I think we should think about most when we talk about internet freedom and the way in which it's being threatened and the way in which the state is abusing its power is to think about the implication, the primary implication, from allowing state power to be asserted without adherence to those limitations that we've imposed in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, and in other forms of documents that were intended to constrain this power. And to me, the principal implication that we're seeing, it's a little bit elusive, it's a bit murky and difficult to get at, but I think it's incredibly profound, is that when you allow the state to exert this kind of power and pervert the ends of its authority, what you really do is you radically change the relationship between the citizenry and the government. You allow a culture of fear to be created that fundamentally transforms the kind of society, the kind of political culture that we're supposed to have. All of which have been completely immunized from any form of legal accountability. There have been no prosecutions, there have been no investigations, there have been no consequences of any kind from these crimes. At the very same time that the United States continues, for ordinary people, for ordinary citizens, for people who are marginalized and relatively powerless, to be the single most oppressive penal state in the Western world. The United States imprisons more of its citizens than any other nation on the planet in absolute numbers, even when compared to countries with much larger populations such as China and India. It imprisons more of its populations by proportion as well. It imprisons people for longer periods of time and for more trivial offenses and with fewer opportunities for parole or other forms of leniency than any country in the Western world. And so this disparity, this dichotomy between the extreme levels of impunity that have been vested in the country's most powerful factions, juxtaposed with the extreme levels of mercilessness and harshness for criminal punishment when it comes to everybody else, is as fundamental a perversion of the rule of law as it gets. The rule of law was intended to secure an equal playing field. When it ceases to do that, it becomes an instrument for entrenching and bolstering and strengthening injustice. So that was my general impetus for writing about the rule of law. But the particular impetus was the involvement that I had in the controversy that arose in 2007 and 2008 over whether
the nation's largest telecommunications companies should be granted retroactive immunity for the role that they played in enabling the Bush administration to spy for 8 years on American citizens without the warrants required by law. And I want to talk a little bit about that controversy because most people know about it, but it was a somewhat complicated issue, and a lot of revealing truths emerge if you go back and kind of dissect it in a systematic way that I think reveal how the rule of law is used and towards what ends by the government. What was really amazing about that controversy was that the law had already been written for 30 years that already granted immunity to the telecoms if they engaged in illegal spying. The laws that were in place that criminalized illegal spying when the government does it were extended to the private telecommunications industry in the wake of the Church Committee, because what the Church Committee in the mid-1970s discovered was that the government was engaged in illegal spying for many decades, but that illegal spying would have been impossible had the private telecommunications company, Western Union, telegram companies, AT&T, other communication carriers, it would have been impossible had those companies not cooperated. And so what Congress wanted to do in the wake of these reforms was to make it a criminal offense to have the telecommunication companies enable spying on their customers by cooperating with the government. And the lawyers for the telecommunications companies were, as you can imagine, heavily involved in this process. And their principal concern was that whatever the Congress did in terms of making it a crime for telecommunications companies to participate in illegal spying, whatever they did, they just simply wanted there to be clarity. They didn't want there to be ambiguity. They wanted the companies to know exactly what they were permitted to do and not permitted to do. And so what the Congress said when they enacted these mid-1970 criminal laws was it is illegal for telecommunications companies to participate in illegal government spying, but they shall be immunized, completely immunized for all civil and criminal liability if they do that in good faith, meaning thinking that what they were doing was legal or believing reasonably that what they were doing is legal. The only way that they could have been held accountable criminally or civilly under the laws that had been in place for 30 years was if what they did was so obviously wrong, was so obviously a violation of the law that there could be no good faith, reasonable explanation to justify what they did, that basically they would have had to have done it knowing that they were breaking the law deliberately and done it anyway. So they already had immunity as long as they just didn't break the law on purpose. And what was really amazing about the controversy that arose over the telecommunications companies was that the reality was that they did break the law on purpose. They participated in exactly what the law was intended to prevent, exactly what it criminalized, which is building a massive network, an apparatus that allowed the government backdoor access to all communications on the part of their companies without any subpoena, without any search warrant, without any legal authorization of any kind. And when customers started suing the telecommunications companies, represented by the Electronic Frontier Foundation and other advocacy groups, federal courts began saying these immunity provisions that the telecommunications companies have are not available to you because what it is that you're alleged to have done, namely allow the government full-scale access to the communications of all of your customers in the United States without search warrants or subpoenas, is so obviously illegal that there can be no good faith explanation for it. What you did is exactly what the law said you have to be criminally held accountable for if you do, which is break the law on purpose. And that's what made that debate so surreal, was that the Congress got together with the U.S. government and decided that we simply could not allow the nation's telecoms to be held accountable, like everybody else is held accountable all the time, even when they break our most important laws knowingly and on purpose. And the Congress got together and retroactively immunized the telecoms. It compelled a dismissal of all lawsuits that had been brought against them for their participation in the illegal spying, and it prevented any criminal investigations in the future. And the reason that was so significant to me and was such an impetus to me to look at what the rule of law does is because during that debate over telecom immunity, the arguments that people were making in defense of immunizing the telecoms was not an argument that said that what the telecoms did wasn't illegal. Nobody was arguing that they didn't violate the law. Nor was anybody arguing that they
broke the law, but only in good faith, because the deliberateness of what they did was so patent that their defenders could not even muster the argument that they didn't break the law illegally and therefore should be immunized under existing law. What they said was, yes, the telecoms broke the law, and yes, they did it knowingly and deliberately, but it is too disruptive to allow the telecoms to be dragged through court and have these programs subjected to the rule of law. They are too important for our security, for our surveillance state, for our ability to defend ourselves. They are too powerful and significant to subject to the rule of law. There was an overt argument made that if you are significantly and sufficiently powerful and influential, that the rule of law literally does not apply to you. That was the argument overtly that was invoked by media and political defenders to justify telecom immunity. And it was that mentality that I really wanted to explore in this book. And what I did was I went back to what I thought was the first instance of this kind of argument being made, which was that if you are sufficiently powerful, then you're simply not subjected to the rule of law. You don't reside within it, you reside above it and beyond it. And the first instance that I believe can be identified, obviously there are all kinds of instances in American history where the law was violated, where the rule of law was breached. The American founding was freedom, and the way in which it's being threatened and the way in which the state is abusing its power is to think about the implication, the primary implication from allowing state power to be asserted without adherence to those limitations that we've imposed in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, and in other forms of documents that were intended to constrain this power. And to me, the principal implication that we're seeing, it's a little bit elusive, it's a bit murky and difficult to get at, but I think it's incredibly profound, is that when you allow the state to exert this kind of power and pervert the ends of its authority, what you really do is you radically change the relationship between the citizenry and the government. You allow a culture of fear to be created that fundamentally transforms the kind of society, the kind of political culture that we're supposed to have. In a free society, I think by definition, the defining dynamic of a free society is that the people who exercise power fear the consequences of what will happen if they abuse that power. They may fear the legal consequences, that they will be charged and prosecuted. They may fear the reputational damages, that they will be looked upon with shame and disgrace. They may fear the political consequences, that they will be stripped of power. They may fear the physical consequences, that they will be attacked or killed. But there has to be some healthy fear on the part of those who exert power about what the consequences will be if they abuse that power in order for a society actually to be free. And I think by contrast, the hallmark of a tyrannical society is the exact opposite, namely that it is those who live in the society, citizens, who fear those who exert power. And the reason they fear those who exert power is because they know that that power can be asserted without any real meaningful limitations or constraints and without any actual accountability or consequences for when that power is abused. And when that dynamic shifts from people who wielding power fearing the consequences of abuse to the people in the society fearing those who wield the power, it brings about all kinds of dangerous and radical changes. And I just want to share with you an anecdote, a personal anecdote, that really kind of underscored for me in this very visceral way exactly how that dynamic functions. And I've told this story before because it really probably is one of the most profound and influential episodes in my political writing career that has kind of really shaped how I look at things and how I prioritize and think about the implications of what's taking place. And it took place in January of 2010. I've spent the last several years writing continuously about WikiLeaks and defending that organization. January 2010 was the first time I ever wrote about WikiLeaks. And January 2010 was a time that almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks, including me. It was before they had really engineered any of their greatest news-breaking leaks in the United States, before the Apache helicopter video and the war logs. And the way that I had learned about WikiLeaks is that the Pentagon in 2008 had prepared a top-secret report. And this top-secret report declared WikiLeaks, expressly declared WikiLeaks, to be an enemy of the state. It said WikiLeaks posed a profound threat to national security, and this report plotted ways to destroy WikiLeaks. It talked about fabricating documents to be submitted to them so that when they published false documents, it would destroy their credibility. It talked about uncovering the anonymity of their sources to make people afraid to leak to them any longer. Essentially, much of what has been done to paralyze WikiLeaks was talked about in this 2008 report. And ironically enough, this 2008 top secret report got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it online. And the New York Times was notified about this report, and they wrote a very short article that I just happened to stumble upon, just kind of coincidentally, and it talked about how this bizarre, obscure transparency group headed by this enigmatic Australian hacker had been declared in secret by the Pentagon to be an enemy of the state, and the Pentagon was talking about destroying it in this report that had just been leaked. And I remember at the time thinking, when I read that article, that any group that has been targeted by the Pentagon as an enemy of the state and that the Pentagon was plotting to destroy was a group that merited a lot more attention and probably a lot of support. And so I went and I researched what this group had done, and I saw all kinds of great transparency projects they had brought to local municipalities in Australia and Berlin and in East Africa regarding corporate dumping, waste dumping, and was really enthused by the model of transparency they had created. And I wrote a long article about the virtues and promise that WikiLeaks held, and I interviewed Julian Assange, and I posted the audio of that interview. And at the end of the article, I encouraged my readers to go and donate money to WikiLeaks electronically. I posted the wiring information about how to donate to their account. I posted the PayPal information about how to transfer money to them via PayPal because they were suffering budgetary constraints and were unable to process important leaks that I knew they were sitting on, and I wanted them to have money so that they could operate more effectively. And I encouraged people to go and donate. And in response to that article, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of people, literally, who said to me in all kinds of venues, at events like this, by email, in the comment section to that article, essentially along the lines of, look, you've persuaded me about the virtue of WikiLeaks and the need to support them. I want to support WikiLeaks. My concern, though, is that if I transfer money to WikiLeaks electronically, that I'm going to end up on some government list somewhere, or that I will be subjected to criminal liability if in the future they're declared a terrorist organization and then I'm charged with materially supporting a terrorist organization. And the people who were saying this to me were not these sort of bizarre conspiracy types, people prone to all sorts of paranoia. Trust me, I recognize those people instantly from extensive interaction with them. These were very rational, sober people. These were American citizens who had decided on their own, out of fear, to relinquish their own core constitutional rights, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It's pure freedom of speech and freedom of association. They had done so out of fear, not because they were imprisoned or threatened with a prison over it, but because they feared what their government could do to them if they exercised those rights. And the reason that was such a profound episode to me was because it made me realize in this very visceral way that you can offer all of the rights that you want in the world on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment. But if you successfully intimidate the citizenry out of exercising those rights, because the citizenry knows that the government no longer operates with constraints in the way it exerts power, then those rights become completely meaningless. And I had the same sort of experience when I wrote about Bradley Manning for the first time, the detention conditions in which Bradley Manning was being held. I wrote about that in December of 2010, and of course the UN ultimately concluded that the treatment to which he was subjected was cruel and inhuman and bordered on torture. And I remember when I first learned of what was being done to Bradley Manning and I first wrote about it, I was asked often by different people, and I actually asked myself, why is it that the government would subject Bradley Manning to this treatment? It seemed counterproductive, just from a purely rational calculus. It turned him into a martyr. It made the controversy not about what he had done, but about what the U.S. government was doing. And in fact, Obama's own State Department spokesman publicly denounced the treatment and then ultimately was forced to resign over it. And it jeopardized the prosecution because it made whatever statements he made in detention subjected to exclusion on the grounds that it was the byproduct of coercion. It just seemed as though it had no rational motive. And the more I thought about it, the more I ultimately realized that what motivated that treatment of Bradley Manning
is the same thing that motivated the threats to prosecute WikiLeaks and its supporters, even though there was no legal basis to do so, even though the Constitution would have barred it. And it was the same motive that led the United States to spend years going around the world kidnapping and abducting people, taking them thousands of miles away to an island prison in the middle of the Caribbean, dressing them in orange jumpsuits and shackles and taking pictures of them and showing the world. It's all designed to send the message, the unmistakable and compelling message, that we, the United States government and the factions whom we serve, can do whatever we want to you if you oppose us. There are no constraints that we honor or adhere to. If you are going to think about blowing the whistle on things that we've done in secret, if you think about leaking our private affairs, if you are considering opposing our foreign policy or what it is that we do in the world in any meaningful way, look at what it is that we've done to Bradley Manning. Look at what it is that we've done to WikiLeaks. Look at what we've done to the people at Guantanamo or the people that we've killed simply on a whim. It is a way of deliberately cultivating this climate of fear in order to deter meaningful dissent and challenge. And that, to me, is the true implication of allowing the government to exercise this kind of power without constraint. And, one of the most insidious aspects of this dynamic is that when you intimidate people out of exercising their rights, it's actually a much more effective form of oppression than if you compel them to relinquish their rights with overt threats or with imprisonment or the kind of hallmarks that we look to as dictatorships or tyranny. And the reason is that it's much more insidious. And the reason I say that is I know from writing and I know from speaking about these issues a lot that there's resistance, even among people who are generally sympathetic to this viewpoint, to thinking about things like tyranny existing in the United States. It seems like hyperbole. We just instinctively resist that notion. And there's lots of reasons why that's true, but the principal reason that it's true is that most people don't engage in the kind of dissent that Aaron Swartz engaged in, or that Bradley Manning engaged in, or that hacktivists with Anonymous engage in because of the extreme levels of sacrifice involved. Most people are successfully intimidated and chilled out of engaging in that kind of resistance or disobedience. Most people end up being relatively passive and unthreatening citizens, people who generally acquiesce to the institutions of power. And when you are generally passive and acquiescent to the institutions of power, you are never a person who will be targeted with oppression. Even in the worst tyrannies, people who submit to power are left alone. People who lived under the Mubarak regime, who liked that regime or who refrained from challenging it, weren't the ones who were shot and imprisoned and tortured. It was those who stood up to the regime. It's always the case that people who are quiescent are basically left alone. And if you're somebody who's basically left alone because you're quiescent, it's very difficult to conceive that there's actual tyranny because it's not being applied to you. The reality, though, is the real measure of how much freedom that exists in a society, the real measure of freedom is not the treatment of people who are generally passive and obedient citizens. It's how people who are dissidents are treated. And it's very easy to convince ourselves that although we're refraining from exercising our rights out of fear, that we're actually choosing to do so, that there's nothing we're being prevented from doing. So if we refrain from doing the kinds of civil disobedience that Aaron Swartz does because we become afraid that we'll be punished even if we adhere to the law, or we refrain from donating to WikiLeaks because we become intimidated out of doing so, it's easy to convince ourselves that it's not that we've been threatened or intimidated or chilled from doing it. We've actually chosen ourselves not to do it. Because nobody likes to admit that they've refrained from doing things out of fear. It's an unpleasant thing to realize about ourselves. We're easily convinced that there's nothing the government is preventing us from doing that we really want to do. I think the socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg put this best. She said, "He who does not move does not notice his chains." He who does not move does not notice his chains. If you're somebody who basically refrains from engaging in the kinds of meaningful challenge to power that triggers this sort of recrimination and punishment, it's easy to convince yourself that it doesn't exist, that those chains really aren't there. But if you look to people engaging in actual dissent in the United States, I think that's where the real lesson lies about how meaningful and potent this climate of fear is. So I just want to conclude by talking about a couple of the most significant trends that I think are the real challenges that pose the greatest threat to political freedom, to internet freedom, because it frames the kind of challenges that I think people who are committed to fighting these things face. And it's easier to fight them if you have an understanding of what those developments are. I write about civil liberties a lot. I talk about civil liberties a lot. And the fascinating thing about writing about civil liberties and talking about civil liberties is that the way in which we have to think about the assault on civil liberties has changed pretty dramatically in the last decade. It was the case in 2002 and 2003 and 2004 and 5 and 6 that if you talked about assaults on civil liberties, what you were really talking about were erosions of rights for foreign nationals on foreign soil, and primarily Muslims, almost exclusively people who are Muslim. And there are certainly exceptions in lots of different ways, but that was the generalized trend. And what has changed pretty fundamentally over the past, say, 4 to 5 years is the importation of war on terror tactics, these tactics that are designed to expand the power of the state, eliminate limitations on state power, and erode core rights. The importation of these tactics into domestic policymaking onto U.S. soil. If you listen to what national security officials in the United States were saying 5 years ago, they would talk about the greatest threat to the United States national security being Al-Qaeda. And then it started changing to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and then it changed to different affiliates of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in northern Africa. It was an emphasis on these foreign threats, so that the powers justified in the name were basically applied on foreign soil. That has changed fundamentally, so that now whenever any Obama official, national security official of the Obama administration, talks about the greatest threat to national security, what they talk about are threats that are primarily domestic in nature and that require domestic responses, particularly the threat of what they call homegrown terrorism or cyber terrorism or cyber warfare. And if you look at the controversies, the civil liberties controversies that have taken place in the past 4 to 5 years, they are almost entirely domestic in nature. So things like the National Defense Authorization Act that justified and codified indefinite detention, the hallmark of Guantanamo, on U.S. soil for U.S. citizens, or massive surveillance programs that were once directed outward that are now increasingly and overwhelmingly directed inward. Or if you look at the prime tactic used by the FBI to prosecute Muslims who have been targeted because of suspicion of political views or political activity, which is that the FBI creates a terrorist plot. It then funds the terrorist plot, it designs it, it goes and recruits people to join the terrorist plot, it provides the resources and the money, it manipulates and cajoles and persuades young people to join these terrorist plots using their knowledge of psychology and how human behavior can be manipulated. They go and get their own recruits for it, and then at the last minute they jump in and heroically stop their own plot and announce to us how they've saved us from the terrorist plot of the FBI. This tactic is now being increasingly used far beyond just Muslims. It's been used to infiltrate the Occupy movement or the activism against NATO policies or anarchist activists. If you look at the regime and fleet of drones that are now being used overwhelmingly inside the United States, what you really see is an importation of the war on terror tactics into the United States. And the reason for that has nothing to do any longer with Islamic radicalism or what we've thought about as terrorism, except as a pretense. It's really about being able to use these policies in anticipation of pacifying and controlling domestic dissent of all kinds. And it's pretty amazing if you look at what the controversy is right now in the confirmation hearing of John Brennan, President Obama's nominee to lead the CIA. The reason that confirmation has not yet taken place is because several senators have posed the question, both to President Obama and to John Brennan. The question is, this power that you claim you have to target people for assassination without charging them with a crime, without due process, without any transparency of any kind, you've already not only claimed the power in theory as applied to U.S. citizens, you've actually exercised the power when you successfully executed the U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and then 2 weeks later, his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman. That power that you claim that you have to target U.S. citizens, does that assassination power also apply to U.S. soil? They're actually asking the question. Senators of the United States are asking the White House and the CIA director, does the president have the authority to assassinate U.S. citizens on U.S. soil without charging them with a crime, without any form of accountability, without any kind of transparency? And as amazing as that is, that question is being posed, even more amazing is the fact that the White House and John Brennan repeatedly refuse to answer the question. They don't even provide an answer. They don't even acknowledge the question has been asked. And the reason for that is because there is a theoretical framework being built that posits that the U.S. government has unlimited power when it comes to any kind of threats that it perceives to take whatever action against them that it wants without any constraints or limitations of any kind. So the White House is refusing to answer that question, not because they've produced or created some assassination squads that are getting ready to be deployed on U.S. soil to kill all sorts of people, presumably. It's because answering that question would be damaging either way. If they say yes, it will illustrate the real radicalism that the government has embraced in terms of how it views its own power. But if they say no, it will jeopardize this critical theoretical foundation that they very carefully have constructed that says that there are no cognizable constraints on how U.S. government power can be asserted. And it doesn't apply only to Islamic radicalism, where people charged with international terrorism. It's being applied increasingly in ways that have absolutely nothing to do with any of those things. And that, to me, is the critical development threatening freedom. So I just want to conclude with this one note, which is I wanted to talk a little bit about the surveillance state and how it's grown, but I'm going to leave some time for questions. So I want to just share with you this one story that I always find so amazing about talking about these issues in the United States, because I know that if you write about these things in the way that, or talk about them in the way that I've just talked about them, like I said before, people get sort of instinctively resistant. Like, well, yeah, I know there's some things the U.S. government's doing that are sort of excessive, but this kind of language just seems a bit hyperbolic, like a bit exaggerated. And what I always find amazing about that is how these issues used to be talked about, not at conferences like this, but just right out in the open in the most mainstream of U.S. institutions. And the quote that I always find most instructive in that regard is a quote from Frank Church, who was a 4-term senator from Idaho. And although he was like fairly liberal on the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, he was very much a mainstream senator. He was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He was an Army veteran, and he was picked to lead the Church Committee, which oversaw the abuses of the intelligence community because he was so trusted with national security secrets. He was hardly some sort of radical. He was not somebody who would be speaking at a conference like this in 2013. And so the thing that he said when he concluded his investigation and uncovered and realized for the first time just how powerful the surveillance apparatus of the United States government had become is really striking to me, not because of the substance of it, although that is interesting, but because of the rhetoric and tone that he used. He basically discovered that the NSA had the capability to eavesdrop on every single form of electronic communication in the entire world, something that had been previously unknown. And what he said about that in an interview with the New York Times was this. He said, quote, "The National Security Agency's capability at any time could be turned around on the American people, and no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything, telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. If a dictator takes over the United States, the NSA could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back." That's the kind of language that just 30 years ago mainstream senators were using to describe the menace posed by the surveillance state if it were ever turned inward. And the condition that he identified, which is if the NSA turns inward, has been completely fulfilled beyond his worst dreams. The NSA is essentially now a domestic organization monitoring all kinds of domestic communications. The Washington Post in 2010 said, quote, every day collection systems at the NSA intercept and store 1.7 billion emails, phone calls, and other forms of communication. William Binney, a longtime national security official who resigned in protest over domestic surveillance, told Democracy Now! Last year, quote, surveillance has increased every year since 9/11. There are 20 trillion transactions assembled by the NSA and related agencies about the U.S. citizens interacting with other citizens. The kind of ubiquitous surveillance state that Frank Church warned in these very strident terms would jeopardize all forms of freedom is not just a possibility, but an indisputable reality. And so I think it's very important to refrain from reacting as though these kinds of dangers are overstated. The last point I just want to make is that I think sometimes it's a little bit difficult to talk about why the loss of privacy is so significant and why the growth of the surveillance state is so menacing. Obviously, there's that trite defense that people will invoke if you have nothing to hide. Why do you care if people are watching? A sort of excuse that people instinctively know is untrue. That's why they protect their email accounts with passwords, why they have locks internally in their homes, why they wouldn't let you, if you ask them, put video cameras up in all rooms of their house. You should ask those questions to people who say that and see what their response is. But I think the more important point is that there is a fundamental difference between how people behave when they are being watched and how they behave when they are able to operate in privacy. There are all kinds of scientific studies about how people who are being monitored change the way that they speak. They become more formal, more stilted when there's a audio recorder placed in front of them, even when conversing with their family members. There was an interesting political controversy in Los Angeles 8 or 9 years ago where kids on a school bus were bullying other children, and it became sort of chronic, and the LA County School Board said, in response to this, we're going to put video cameras in all of our school buses. And the objection was, well, how can you afford that? It would be incredibly prohibitive just from a cost. And they said, no, we're not going to put working video cameras in the buses. We're just going to put faux video cameras. Only a small percentage will actually be functioning because they know that the mere presence of video cameras changes behavior in the way that the state wants. It is only in the private realm when we can operate and function and explore and think. That is the only place where dissent and creativity and challenge to orthodoxy reside. And the more a state becomes, the more a society becomes one of ubiquitous surveillance, those are the attributes: dissent, creativity, questioning of convention and orthodoxy, exploration. Those are the attributes that begin to die. And if you're somebody who's in power, if you are part of the faction that wields power, those are the attributes that you want to die. And that is the reason why this pervasive surveillance, especially on the internet, which is supposed to be the instrument that democratizes political conflict, is so menacing, because it threatens to turn the internet from what it should be, which is a weapon used to challenge and subvert power, into yet another weapon and instrument that shields, protects, and strengthens it. And so those are sort of the trends that I think are most important when we talk about internet freedom, and that come out of these cases where there's all kinds of excessive prosecution. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully we have some time for questions.
Let's see if one of these works. Now it sounds on. Okay, now it's on.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Very good. Okay, Matt, come on. I've invited Matt Stoller to ask the first question, and then I think Karen is next.
Thanks for the inspiring speech. So I had an opportunity to ask an audience once about the concept of freedom in the context of going through a security line at the airport. and I asked if people thought the TSA was too intrusive, and everyone was like, absolutely. And then I said, who wants to go onto a plane with no screening whatsoever? And everyone was like, oh, no, because we want to be searched, right? Or we want to see other people being searched. And you know, one of the things that I think you're talking about is the interaction between culture and law and these giant institutions. And you know, one of the things I saw on the chat board was how people were saying, well, you know, what you're saying is absolutely right, but we do have enemies that we have to deal with in some context. And actually, when you think about treason statutes, treason hinges upon the United States being at war and there being a declared enemy. And actually, the United States, there is no declaration of war going on right now. So the concept of enemy continues to be malleable. So my question is sort of overall, if the population is afraid, with that, they want to be screened before going onto an airline. They do feel like there are enemies. They do feel like these massive surveillance institutions are being helpful in some sense. What do you do? And is there a legitimate way to, is it legitimate to be afraid of enemies? Do these institutions have a legitimate place in our society? Or do you just get rid of the NSA, the FBI, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it gets to the heart of, you know, what I think are the questions about political tactics and strategy. You know, you put your finger on the reason why so much of this endures, which is, you know, we can get together, and if you think about privacy a lot, or you think about the kind of issues that Aaron Swartz worked on with, you know, information being controlled in an academic setting or other settings, these are kind of ethereal, esoteric concepts, whereas fear is very primitive. It doesn't, no one has to stand up at a conference like this and say, I'm going to explain to you why it actually matters if you're on a plane that blows up. People understand on a very primal level why that matters. And so the challenge is to find a way to compete with those primal drives. And that's part of why, you know, I think it's so important to talk about the threat and dangers that are posed when privacy is eliminated as well in a very concrete way, because people do, as I said, have this instinctive attachment to privacy, which you can demonstrate to them fairly quickly. And I don't think it's an either or thing. I don't think that there's either let the FBI and the NSA run wild without constraints or completely abolish them entirely. I think you want some reasonable balance in order to persuade people that that's necessary. But I think that oftentimes people who are privacy advocates or advocates of civil liberties fail, not intellectually, but strategically and politically, because they don't think about how to translate their values into ones that other people react to instinctively in the way they react to fear. The other thing I would say is that, you know, the idea of war, like the fact that we are a nation at war, which is what we've been going around beating our chest proclaiming for the last 12 years with no end in sight, is at the heart of it, and this is actually a reform that's possible, to make the United States no longer be legally a nation at war, whether it means repealing the authorization to use military force or thinking about terrorism in different ways. It's always been the case that war is the time when leaders get to exercise power without constraints. Like 2,000 years ago, Cicero said, when men pick up arms, the law falls mute. On a battlefield, there's no such thing as law. People who are leaders who command a battlefield can do whatever they want. They can kill, they can detain, they can surveil, they can do everything in secrecy with no due process, no checks. And the theory of the United States government, two successive administrations, that it's not a battlefield that's a finite space, but the entire globe is a battlefield, is a theory that says that the president has authority and power to do essentially whatever he wants anywhere in the world, including U.S. soil, without constraints. That's why this war paradigm, global war, endless war, is so threatening. And so I think in terms of concrete political reform as a way of addressing some of these problems, repealing both the statutory basis but also the political rhetoric that looks at what we're doing as a war rather than trying to prevent criminality or prosecute criminals is a really crucial priority, because if you do have a war paradigm, it doesn't just justify it legally, it sort of degrades the mentality of the population. The population becomes more bloodthirsty, more savage, more frightened, and then therefore more willing to submit to these kind of extreme theories of state power. Okay.
Glenn, my question is about rule of law, the internet, and state capture, and your premise that the internet is going to get information to enable participatory democracy. I'm a lawyer. I have been trying for 6 years to make my story public, and I've been using the internet, and nobody has heard of me. I bought a World Bank bond, and I sued because the World Bank was out of compliance. And 188 ministers of finance settled my case, and the DC Circuit Court of Appeals refused to recognize that settlement. And this issue is now in front of the Congress, it's in front of all of the governors, and it's in front of the Pentagon. And we're going to find out which side the Pentagon comes down on. Because I have told the Supreme Court that if they do not decide whether or not there's rule of law, there will be A, a currency war, B, there will be martial law in the United States, and C, there will be a currency war internationally. And nobody has heard my story, and it's not for want of trying.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with the internet is there's a lot of rhetoric surrounding the internet about how it's this weapon that can be used to democratize voices, to bring attention to things that would otherwise be ignored, and it's true, but it's hardly some panacea. And the challenge of the internet is that there are tens of millions of people who are trying to use the internet in the way that you're trying to use the internet. And it's a matter of figuring out how to harness that power in a way that can be most effective. But I think the key thing to think about in terms of the internet is a technology that can be used to subvert power. We've seen it used that way in all kinds of different ways. I mean, you can have your voice be heard. You don't have a guarantee of having your voice heard, but you can certainly have your voice heard in a way that you wouldn't if corporations maintained a monopoly over discourse. You can organize on the internet. You can disseminate information on the internet. You can communicate with your fellow citizens without the mediation of institutions. It also, though, has the potential to achieve the opposite effects. If surveillance becomes sufficiently ubiquitous on the internet, then the ability of the state to monitor and surveil what we do will become far greater than it ever was before the advent of the internet. And ironically, the promise of the internet won't only be unrealized, the opposite effect will be achieved. And that's why when people in their 20s ask me what kinds of issues they think need the most attention, I always talk about internet freedom and the war over the internet as being the primary priority, because ultimately all of the questions that we talk about, the resolution of them will depend upon how the internet ends up being used. Is it this instrument for free organizing and association and democratizing discourse and ability to organize and dissent, or will it just become yet another weapon in the hands of the state and the factions it serves, the most potent weapon yet to control and monitor and surveil what it is that we do? And that question is very much unresolved. Yep.
Glenn, thank you for a brilliant speech. I'm sorry, I am Jerry Nelson. I hope that doesn't embarrass you. It's
No, thank
nice
you.
to hear it from someone else once in a while. I think that the speech showed your trademark controlled fury, and I thank you for that discipline. I think it also is pathetic that you have to explain to the American public that they are losing their democracy. A comment on those who take a passive role and do not provoke the forces holding power over them. If, as a nice Jewish boy from New York, I have read the Holocaust literature, and I think a lesson of that literature is that if you try to join the winning side, you will eventually have to compromise your values and not die a happy person. I personally feel that the United States has passed the point of no return, where the democracy can be saved. I feel that, I note that democracy is actually an aberration in the history of mankind. This country was the first major nation, with all due respect to Switzerland, to be created as a democracy in 2,000 years. What gives you hope? Or is that why you live overseas?
No, I live overseas for reasons having nothing to do with any of the things that you just asked about. I reject completely the premise that there's no hope, that things can't be changed, that things can't be reversed, that we're past the point of no return. I also don't believe it when people come to places like this and say that they think that. I don't actually believe that there's authenticity or conviction behind that claim, because if people really believe that we were past the point of no return, that nothing could be changed, there's zillions of things you could be doing, more sort of distracting, entertaining than being involved in a political discussion that you think will ultimately be completely inconsequential. And let me just tell you why I think I think that's a misguided view. As tempting as I realize that it is, and I confess to that temptation myself sometimes. I think that the clearest lesson of virtually every component of history, whether it be the history of other countries or the history of the United States, whether it be distant history or recent history, is that any structure that is built by human beings, no matter how invulnerable or formidable it appears, can be modified or torn down and replaced by other human beings if the right passion and strategy and conviction are summoned. And I don't understand how anybody could ever embrace a defeatist mindset when you look at things like the Arab Spring, where the populations who are the most deprived on the planet and have been kept in complete deprivation deliberately for decades were able to challenge and subvert the most entrenched tyrannies, the ones that the greatest superpower on the earth has been propping up for decades. Or if you look at the history of the United States, where as critical as we can and should be of the political culture of the United States contains all kinds of examples of marginalized and powerless groups advancing and progressing and claiming their rights. And ultimately, that really is the issue. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, said, look to see what people will quietly submit to, and you will have the exact measure of the injustice that will be imposed on them. An incredibly profound observation, that the only injustice that will exist is the injustice that people permit to exist by submitting to it. And Benjamin Franklin, when he walked out of the Constitutional Convention, it may be apocryphal, but it's certainly revealing, when asked what it is that he created by a woman passing by on the street, said, "A republic if you can keep it." Meaning, we can create all these great structures on a piece of paper, but there will be all sorts of people wanting to undermine and subvert and abuse the power we've invested in them. Ultimately, the responsibility is with you, the citizenry, to safeguard it. And that is the lesson of history, is that people binding together, not to hope that rights are given to them or to expect that rights will be honored, but claiming those rights can succeed. And there's all sorts of examples over and over in every culture and in every context that prove that, that make me believe that without any real doubt.
So no democracy has ever been left on autopilot.
Yeah, basically. If we're failing, it's not because it's inevitable, but because we're allowing that to happen. Yeah.
Mitzi Herrera, I do work for a local government. Two quick questions. One is, besides the obvious technological advances, what fundamentally distinguishes the surveillance that we have today from what the FBI did in the 60s, COINTEL programs and so forth? And given what you said today, more provocatively, where do you come out on gun owners who feel that they are deeply concerned that the government is tracking lists of which guns they own and how many, and that newspapers want to publish that, and where they feel that they have both a constitutional right to privacy as well as to ownership?
Yeah, those are two great questions. As far as the contrast with the 60s is concerned, I mean, of course, the abuses of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and the NSA were what led to the reforms that were supposed to constrain these abuses from taking place. And what we've seen over the last 10 years was first the covert violation of all those laws that were passed, followed by, once it was revealed that the government was breaking the law, not punishing them, but then passing new laws designed to retroactively authorize what it is that they've done. So we've basically consciously returned to what in the 60s and 50s were unknown abuses, in having both political parties embrace and then statutorily approve of those abuses, the only difference being that the technology makes surveillance much more invasive, much more ubiquitous, much more threatening. Because as technology advances, as surveillance technology advances, if there are no constraints on the ability of the state to monitor and store what it is that we do, when the technology is more primitive, the surveillance is less invasive. When it's more sophisticated, as it is now, and getting more sophisticated all the time, when we do more in a venue that is subject to surveillance, which is the internet, then the surveillance becomes much more invasive. It really does become ubiquitous. As Frank Church said, there's no place to hide. As far as the gun ownership issue is concerned, leaving aside the question of like the Second Amendment and what the role of guns are in the society and all of that, I've been pretty amazed at the debate over gun control over the last 3 to 4 months, to the extent that it entails the argument from advocates of gun ownership who say, some with some sincerity, some without, but who make the argument that one of the reasons why an armed citizenry is necessary is because it's necessary to guard against state abuse of power or tyranny. And there are lots of reasonable arguments to make to dispute that or even mock it. The idea that having handguns is going to let you stand up to the massive national security apparatus that has been built up is a bit laughable. But what is kind of grotesque is the kind of response to that that seeks to mock the very idea that concerns over the abuse of power by the federal government or tyranny are somehow frivolous. And I think you see that a lot by gun control advocates mocking the idea that in the United States, this great bastion of freedom and democracy, to be concerned about tyranny is to be paranoid. And it is true as well historically that one lesson is that democracies can very easily transform either through an overthrow of the democratic system or through majoritarian sentiment into something that does resemble a tyrannical regime much more so than a free one. And I think mocking that concern on the part of people who are advocates of gun control reveals this kind of naivete and this undue faith in institutions that's very authoritarian in nature, especially among groups of people who like to pride themselves on being sort of rational and opposed to state power. And I think the debate has been pretty revealing in that regard.
So just quick follow-up. Do you think that in Virginia, the newspapers should be able to publish the name of every person who bought a gun in Virginia?
I haven't thought enough about that issue to give you any kind of like real opinion. My first reaction would be that newspapers probably have the right to report that. To the extent that infringes on other rights, I'd have to think that through, to be honest. I don't have a clear answer for you.
Well, Glenn, I have consulted the government database, and I know when your plane is.
I'm sure you do. Does that mean I have to leave now?
You're welcome to stay, but I know that you have other obligations in other states.
Okay.
So.
Well, thank you very much for listening and the great questions. Appreciate it.